Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sally Whipple, and I'd like to welcome you to Connecticut's Old State House for a conversation at noon. As you may know, these monthly conversations usually begin with a peek into Connecticut's history through the eyes of a historian, and then move into a panel discussion that blends history with current issues and insights. Diane Smith, who is the Connecticut Network Senior Producer for Program Development, moderates the discussions and brings you into the conversation through questions and answers near the end of the program. These programs are generously supported through a grant from Connecticut Humanities, and we're also pleased to say that we present 4 programs a year in partnership with our friends at Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history. We hope to welcome you back 1 month from today, March 25th, for a conversation with author Susan Campbell focused on her new book about Isabella Beecher Hooker and her work as an activist. But for now, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Diane Smith, who will introduce our speaker, our panelists, and our program. Thank you, Diane.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so appreciative that you were able to come since we had to cancel for snow last time, although I imagine a lot of things have been canceled for snow this year. But we're glad you're here. In case you're wanting to see this again or you want to let your friends know about this, this program is being taped by CTN. It will be aired on CTN, and it will be available on demand at ct-n.com. So you'll be able to offer other people the opportunity to hear the discussion today. I should say that we'd love to have you participate. If anyone wants to ask a question at some point during the panel discussion, not during the main presentation, but during the panel discussion, please raise your hand and we'll try to get to you with a microphone so that everybody can hear you. So thank you so much. So when we're contemplating the history of civil rights in the United States, nearly everyone recognizes the stories of Rosa Parks, Jim Crow lunch counters, and the Little Rock Nine as shaping our national conversation on racism and equality. But even as our attention was focused on the March on Washington and school integration by the National Guard, Hartford and cities like it across the nation were busy making contributions of their own to the groundswell that ultimately defined the American civil rights movement. It seems fitting that we are gathering here today at the historic site of the Amistad captives' trial for a fascinating look by Dr. Stacey Close of Eastern Connecticut State University at Hartford and the modern civil rights movement. In the 50s and the 60s, while Americans were sitting in and marching, individuals like Reverend Dr. John Jackson and organizations such as the state's Interracial Commission, the NAACP, and the Black Panthers were stirring citizens in Hartford and elsewhere in Connecticut to fight for their rights. You can read a lot more about this in a wonderful book that has just been released. It's called African American Connecticut Explored, and it's a collection of more than 50 essays in collaboration between the Amistad Center of Art and Culture and the Magazine of Connecticut History, Connecticut Explored. The book really is extraordinary, not only for its breadth, but it allows the reader to really understand the experience of African Americans through the eyes of real people who influenced history very often at the grassroots level right here in the city and elsewhere in our state. Today we're going to focus on a portion of the book that covers Hartford in the civil rights era. Now, although historians would technically place the beginning of the civil rights movement at about 1954, it's clear from this book that things really began to change for African Americans in Connecticut during World War II. One of the editors and authors is our guest speaker today, Dr. Stacey Close. Dr. Stacey Close works currently as the Interim Associate Vice President for Equity and Diversity at Eastern Connecticut State University. Stacey Close is also a professor of history and has taught courses that include African American history, the history of the South, churches and the modern civil rights movement, African American religion, and Black nationalism. He's not currently teaching this semester because of his administrative responsibilities, and I asked him if he missed it, and he said, I do, but I won't when the papers pile up at the end of the term. So at any rate, that's a little bit of an insight into Dr. Stacey Close. Please welcome Dr. Close.
Thank you, Diane, for that wonderful introduction. And also, I want to thank Sally and Rebecca Tabor-Conover for the invitation as well. What I hope to do for about 20 minutes or so is just to talk briefly with you about Hartford and the modern civil rights movement, the time period from 1943 to 1968. And so my general title is Hartford and the Modern Civil Rights Movement, The Ties That Bind. I use that term very much because the civil rights movement, North and South, is tied together intimately, and that is true in terms of its development. And so I begin my discussion, as many of you may have known from past discussions by me, I begin my discussion in the South because of the massive movement of Southerners from the South to the North, in part because of employment and tobacco, but also because of the lynchings and other types of violence that went on during World War I and in the time period before. But for African Americans in Connecticut, particularly those in the Hartford area, they found themselves confronting the evils of segregation in North as well as South. For those migrants who came north, they left behind their brothers, their sisters, sometimes parents in the South, with a message of hope, but also with a hope for things for betterment in the North. Now, here in Hartford, what you find as far as civil rights, there's a great fight for jobs, there's a great fight for housing, there's a great fight for education. Some of those same things that were part of the fight in the South as well. And if you look at the time period 1943, what is going on? The country, of course, is in the midst of World War II. And in the midst of World War II, you have one of the most vicious race riots ever in Detroit. That race riot has an impact on the establishment of the Interracial Commission in Connecticut, but it's also impacted by an event that happened a year earlier in 1942, when Reverend Dr. John Jackson, the pastor of Union Baptist Church, was heading to a National Baptist Convention down in the South. As he was moving through a train car in the South, two white men set upon him and beat him viciously. That beating, of course, caught the attention of people in Hartford, and there's this massive rally to fight for the rights of Reverend John Jackson. People raised money, they raised funds, and they urged the Justice Department to do something about the beating. Very little was done, but in terms of that event, it helps to spur on the establishment of the Interracial Commission. Now, there are a number of states in the country that were establishing interracial commissions, later on the Commission of Human Rights and Opportunities here in Connecticut. But Reverend John Jackson became a commissioner, and he also became a voice for the downtrodden and a voice for the poor. The first staff member was a Southerner, Frank Simpson. Frank Simpson, for a time, he was called Mr. Civil Rights. For the Hartford NAACP, who had its roots back in 1917, they too saw the ties that bound them to the South. Because during World War II, one of the Scottsboro boys, in need of help in terms of his life, he decided that he was going to come to Connecticut. Well, he couldn't come to Connecticut without support, particularly support from the NAACP. And the person offering a huge amount of support was Dr. Alan Jackson, a local physician who had graduated from Howard University. And he took the NAACP from the 30s up to 1945 and made it a movement organization. And what I mean by a movement organization, he got them not only to increase their membership to more than 1,000, but he also got them to take a look at more closely what was going on in the South and become deeply involved as he did. And throughout the 40s, the NAACP began to negotiate and began to protest locally to get employment for African Americans on the police force and also in the fire department. The names that people remember in terms of Hartford are the names of people like Lemuel Custis and Ella Brown. And if you were living in the North End, those were names of heroes of people who you would encounter. When it came to newspapers, the Hartford Chronicle, a black-owned newspaper, became the mouthpiece and an organ of protest for blacks throughout the city. Along with that, when it came to educated blacks, most would get, in terms of higher education, get that in the South, not in Connecticut. There were very few opportunities for higher education for blacks in the 1940s. But for people like Barbara Aline, who went to Fisk, Bose Barlow, who went to Howard, and Walter Doc Hurley, the South was the place to be in terms of higher education. But they would come back and began to share what they learned in college here locally. For local groups, as I've mentioned, the NAACP and others, their constant refrain was jobs, housing, and education in the North. But they also recognized that just like in the South, discrimination existed. Maybe not at the same level in the South in terms of the signs and the vicious lynching, but it existed nevertheless. By the time you get to the 1950s and the Brown decision of 1954, It was discussed widely in Hartford, and when more than 50,000 black people in Montgomery decided to walk in dignity rather than ride in shame, Hartford residents held rallies all over the city to determine how best to support Montgomery. Some people suggested that maybe it could be done through funds. Other people suggested that maybe it could be done through travel down to Alabama. But in terms of that support allowed for an increasing interest in having greater freedom for blacks in Hartford. By the 1950s, what you find is that African Americans began to use the power of coalitions that helped them to put into power the Reverend Robert Moody. He was elected to the school board in 1951. And for people who were living in Hartford in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, the name of Robert Moody was legendary, in part because you never missed not meeting Reverend Moody. And what I mean by that, Reverend Moody had a way of introducing himself with his powerful handshake that would leave your hand in extreme pain. He was a tiny little veteran of World War I, but he gave you the Baptist handshake. And if you don't understand what I mean by the Baptist handshake, you'll have to encounter a minister from that period to understand what I mean by the Baptist handshake. Because Reverend Moody would administer the Baptist handshake, and the young people always talked about that Baptist handshake. This same minister also created a soup kitchen and a wood pile for his congregation during the 1930s. And that's the kind of individuals who came on board in terms of elected officials. You also had in the 1950s the election of businessman John Clark. So the black community is able to elect John Clark, they're able to elect Robert Moody through coalitions within the white community. The same thing can be said for Wilfred X. Johnson, and also later on Bosch Barlow being placed on the court. These efforts were done as a result of coalitions. But in order to have these coalitions, you have to have a place that everyone knows about. And in the north end of Hartford, for years, the place was Tom Parrish's Corner. And if you were in the north end, that was the place where you could find information, and you could also learn about civil rights issues right on that corner, because Parrish's family had a long, distinguished history in Hartford. It went back to the period around World War I. The family also had been strongly influenced in terms of business. They once owned what was called the Parrish Hotel. And so if you could get to Tom Parrish, you could get to that corner, you could get to a seat of part of the power that existed. Now, the 1950s was also a time of revolution. And what I mean by revolution, in terms of revolutionary ideas. And nothing struck a chord in terms of revolutionary ideas like the words of Paul Robeson. Robeson, of course, as many of you know, had a home in Enfield, Connecticut. But it was a 1952 concert at Weaver High School that drew the attention of thousands of people throughout the city. Now, Weaver's concert was of concern because of his ties to communism, or perceived ties to communism. And there were scores of people who did not want him to sing at Weaver High School in 1952. The question was put before the school board. Now, the school board then was headed by Lewis Fox, the legendary Lewis Fox. The school board initially voted 6-3 to allow Robeson to sing. But because so many letters poured into the school board, they decided that what they were going to do was to vote again. But they allowed in people in the audience to sit and listen to deliberations. And as they went back and forth among the people on the school board about the vote, it finally came to Reverend Robert Moody to talk about his views on whether or not Robeson should be allowed to vote. Reverend Moody said he saw no reason as to why Robeson shouldn't be allowed to sing. He was among the people who voted 6-3 that Robeson be allowed to sing. And he held that concert in 1952, and Robeson explained why he had the right to sing anywhere he wanted to. Because he believed that in terms of America needed to do better in terms of its African-American citizens, not just in the South, but also in the North as well. Now, in terms of the 1950s also saw an incident that people called the Windsor Street Riot. It really wasn't much of a riot, but on July 19, 1958, what happens is that there's an altercation between a black resident and a police officer. This incident leads to a number of arrests and also the calling in of more than 20 police according to the papers, to quelch a throng of some 500. Well, that issue, of course, will eventually see redevelopment of the Windsor Street area, an area that blacks for years referred to as the Bottoms, or people in general who lived in the area referred to as the Bottoms. The 1950s saw significant change in terms of politics, in terms of civil rights in Hartford, but it also saw some sadness as well. 1960 saw the passing of the Reverend Good Clark of Mount Olive Baptist Church. Now, Mount Olive Baptist Church was actually one of those transplanted churches from the South during the period of migration. The new pastor of Mount Olive was the Reverend Richard Battles. Reverend Battles became a close friend and confidant of Dr. King. He becomes extremely important in the modern civil rights movement in terms of fundraising for the Southern movement, and he also brings Dr. King to Hartford on a number of occasions. One of the most exhilarating moments when Dr. King comes to Hartford is 1962, because he doesn't come alone. He comes with the legendary singer Mahalia Jackson, and they come to the Bushnell, and King begins to talk about the Southern movement, but he also reminds people in Hartford that there are horrible problems in terms of housing and discrimination in Hartford, remembering the problems both north and south. But one of the highlights was seeing Mahalia Jackson at the podium singing her gospel tunes, because she saw Dr. King as a son to her in terms of the movement. But for Hartford, you will also see in terms of the ties that bind that people in Hartford were quite willing, very liberal in their approach to the movement. And what I mean by liberal, in the South, groups like SNCC needed automobiles. They got automobiles in part because a Hartford automobile dealer was willing to give them cars for the movement. Gave them cars so that SNCC members could go from place to place throughout the South. What they would do was invite 4 young men who were part of SNCC up to Hartford to get the cars, and they would drive them back to the South. So there's this clear tie between the movement in the South and the movement in the North in terms of support. There's support in terms of fundraising by people like Reverend Battles. And there's also support in terms of young people. Young people, both black and white from the Hartford area, were willing to go down south and be a part of the movement. Take, for example, a professor at Trinity, Jack Chatfield. Jack Chatfield, as a college student, was a member of the student movement for change in Terrell County. And for people who live in Georgia, they refer to Terrible County at the time, at least blacks referred to Terrell County, Georgia, as Terrible Terrell because of the viciousness and the violence. If you lived across the way in Baker County, you referred to Baker County as Bad Baker County because of the sheriffs. But it's these young people, both black and white, who willingly will go into the South, join with blacks there, and begin to confront segregation and discrimination. You also find that locally, when it came to Albany, Georgia, busloads of people boarded a bus and went down and became part of the Albany movement. One of the people involved in that movement was former Mayor Thurman Milner. They were watched over legally by well-known New Haven attorney Constance Baker Motley, making sure that they were not treated too badly in Albany, although the conditions were clearly not very good. Now, in terms of the South is known for its nonviolent activism. Nonviolent activism in terms of student protests, kneel-ins, sit-ins, etc. You also had those things in Hartford as well. In 1963, the Northern Student Movement helped to establish a group in Hartford called NECAP, the North End Community Action Program. They brought kneel-ins, picketing to places like Statler Hilton, Terry Square Diner, and also to Daniel's Cadillac, where they were arguing for the right for employment for blacks in those places. In addition, they brought the music of the civil rights movement to Hartford through freedom singers like Blanton Hall. Hall was one of the first students from Albany State College to be arrested for attempting to integrate the Albany, Georgia bus station. In terms of confronting slumlords, NECAP confronted slumlords, they confronted rent gougers, and they even confronted the Chamber of Commerce about employment for poor people. Not alone in this effort to try to transform Hartford, you also find that CORE, the local CORE chapter, would argue with F.M. Schaefer Brewing for jobs for blacks in the city. By 1963, there is a famous March on Washington. Some 5,000 Connecticut people are part of that campaign that will see some 200,000 people or more in Washington, D.C., fighting not just for jobs, but for justice. When they returned home, though, they felt the crushing blow of the explosion of the 16th Street Baptist Church, not physically, but learning of the deaths of 4 little girls and also the injury of some 30 or more. Those ties, of course, because there were people in Alabama who were in the Hartford area, they clearly understood that while the 16th Street Baptist Church exploded in Alabama, it also exploded in Connecticut as well, and in Hartford. For people like Wilbur Smith of the local NAACP, after this time period, he said something that was poignantly clear and very true. He said to those who would listen, time is running out. Because there were young men who were part of the nonviolent movement who were growing impatient. And Smith said, time is running out. In terms of time running out, what you began to see is an intensification of protests, not just in Connecticut, not just in Hartford, but all across the country. There were picketing of organizations that were tied not just statewide, but also nationally to the movement in the South. Blacks in the Hartford area picketed companies that were tied to the Hammer Mill Paper Company, because the Hammer Mill Paper Company planned to open a plant in Selma, where the voting rights campaign was going on. And they believed that the only way to deal with this was to begin a nationwide campaign against Hammer Mill. In terms of the city had already experienced the powerful influence of Malcolm X. Malcolm had been in Hartford since the 1950s. But in 1962, when he came to the city, he was there to organize a rally in honor of Los Angeles Mosque Secretary Ronald Stokes, who had been murdered in Los Angeles in a confrontation with officers. Malcolm saw, and he related to people, a side of Hartford that most residents missed. His message of self-respect and self-defense, though, was not missed by scores of young black men in Hartford. These are the young black men who saw in Malcolm's message opportunity, but also something they could relate to. It is this message of Malcolm that nationwide, it would impact the emergence of the Black Power movement. And in Hartford, eventually the group that became synonymous with Black Power as far as leaders were concerned was a group called the Black Caucus. Now, the Black Caucus, one of its key leaders was a man by the name of John Barber. John Barber, for people who knew him, had a presence to him. John Barber wore his African garb, and he also carried with him a large staff. So he had this presence in the 1960s when he came to events. But John Barber was educated, a Morehouse man. He had also been an NAACP leader, and he was well known throughout the country by Dr. King. He actually had been executive assistant for Dr. King at one point in time. But he began to talk about self-defense, and he also began to talk about more vigilant confrontation. And what Barber meant by more vigilant confrontation was taking a protest into the south end of the city, a mostly white south end of the city, at a time when Hartford was growing more and more divided. Now, that South End March, the initial South End March, did not materialize. It didn't materialize in part because the people who led it were arrested. It also didn't materialize in part because of protection, police protection. Barber and his compatriots would eventually complete their march in September of 1967. Not before disturbances or riots, as some people refer to them, would hit the north end of Hartford. The similar event in terms of the riots, or the thing that seemed to set it off, people argued, was a confrontation at a luncheonette in the north end. A young man by the name of William Tools went into a luncheonette to order, one paper said, a hot dog. That confrontation would eventually lead to his arrest and 4 young men being upset about how he was treated during that arrest. That arrest will lead to rock throwing, bottle throwing, and the beginning of disturbances or riots in Hartford. Now, these riots, as far as black power individuals were concerned, were believed to be rebellions. So from 1967 through 1970, what black power leaders said happened in Hartford were rebellions, not mere riots of destruction. This is a time period where you also see the discussions about Vietnam, the discussions about the Black Panther Party, and also you begin to see key leaders changing their views about what is important in terms of the struggle. Not that leaders of nonviolence began to abandon nonviolence, but they began to see that in terms of black power, it could offer some opportunities. If you ask the Urban League leaders, they said it meant economic improvement. If you ask members of the NAACP, some of them said the black power members were not created by them, they were created by the white power structure who didn't do anything about the problems that people have been constantly outlining in terms of housing, in terms of employment, and in terms of education and discrimination. For people in the Hartford area, though, 1968, particularly April 4th of 1968, would see the assassination of Dr. King. That assassination would send cries of pain and also cries of anger throughout the Hartford area. Young men would take to the streets throughout the United States, and among the 20,000 who were arrested were scores of young men in the Hartford area. For Dr. King, his death left a huge void, but his message that he reiterated time and time again in Hartford, a message about housing, a message about discrimination, a message about better employment, remained. Before his death, Dr. King had talked about the poor, and he had begun the process of establishing a Poor People's Campaign. That Poor People's Campaign, in part, made its way to Hartford, but not fully. And what I mean by not fully, there was supposed to be a significant rally for the Poor People's Campaign inside Hartford, but it never materialized. But the Poor People's Campaign did come to Washington, D.C. King remembered the poor, and for those people who were left behind after his assassination, Ralph Abernathy, he would make his way to Connecticut and talk to people about the poor and the Poor People's Campaign. And in smaller cities like New London and places like Willimantic, they did carry out Poor People Campaign marches because they understood that in terms of this freedom struggle, that they had to continue to give them more to receive their less. And in terms of Hartford, they understood that the ties that bound them to the South would often see them giving them more to receive their less. Thank you.
Join me now. Dr. Foster, would you come up? And Dr. Adams, will you join us on the panel? That'd be great. Dr. Close, that was
Thank you.
was wonderful.
Yes. Hey,
We do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. We do have someone roaming with a microphone, so if you just raise your hand until I call on you, we'll get the microphone to you. Okay, and Ron, do you have your mic? Where I don't see you. Ron, right over here. Let me just introduce the panelists, and then I'll call on you, okay? Joining us now is Dr. Benjamin Foster, Jr., an educator and author of Looking for Payoff, a new schooling for African-American inner-city youth. Dr. Foster served as a consultant to the nation's first public school-only voucher demonstration in San Jose, California. That experiment was the predecessor to the charter and magnet schools movement. Also joining us is award-winning journalist and historian, Dr. Anne-Marie Adams. Thank you for coming. Founder and editor of the Hartford Guardian and author of the upcoming book, The Origins of Sheff versus O'Neill, The Troubled Legacy of School Segregation in Connecticut. And since you did have your hand up, I'll let you start out with a question, sir.
Do you think there's been progress when the same basic issues that concerned the black community back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are still here? Employment, education, and housing.
In terms of progress, There has been some progress, but there is still a whole lot of work that needs to be done in terms of, particularly in terms of the unemployment rate, particularly for our young men in the African American community. There has to be significant work in that area. In terms of education, of course, there certainly needs to be significant work in that area as well. I think there was a recent report about the achievement gap here in Connecticut. And the significant point that I got from the report that I heard was that the achievement gap here in Connecticut is actually larger than it is in Mississippi. And so historically, when people talk about things like the achievement gap, usually Mississippi is last in everything in this country. But not in the terms of this achievement gap. Connecticut is far behind in that area. So I think the point you make is right. There's a whole lot of work that we need to do. There were some strides made, but there's still a lot of work that can be done and needs to be done.
Since we're on the topic of education, and Dr. Foster, that really is your specialty, I wanted to ask you about, in terms of making progress. In 2011, the graduation rate for Hartford high schools was about 60% of students actually graduating within the typical 4-year curriculum. And of course, we still have a huge lawsuit that's still underway today, the Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit. So how are we doing in Hartford in terms of education?
Well, we're making strides, and we have, as Dr. Close indicated, very long ways to go. I graduated the first graduating class of Hartford High that's now located on Forest Street, along with some of your audience. And I think we would all conclude that it has improved since our day. However, there is so much more that needs to be done. The primary difference is that the joblessness is so prevailing now as opposed to then. Manufacturing is no longer a part of the Hartford economy. When I became a young man in Hartford, there was always jobs available. We could do many things to earn a living that was legal. Today, many of the young men are in the secondary economy, and they virtually have no outlets, and that's truly unfortunate. But I currently serve as the state chair, education chair of the Connecticut State Conference of the NAACP, and we're constantly looking at the data. And in all of the 5 major cities, including Hartford, there's a tremendous education achievement gap. And there are many initiatives that is being tried. I am a proponent of cultural education being used, and by that I mean having our students understand their history, understand their contributions to the American mosaic. And that's another story. But your question is very, very important. And I guess I would just conclude my remarks by saying we have not made the kinds of strides in education in the 21st century, in this information age, that we ought to have.
Dr. Adams, you started the Hartford Guardian. Previously, I believe you were at the Hartford Courant. So you have been a journalist in this city for a while. So I imagine that you, if you weren't here at the beginning of Sheff versus O'Neill, you certainly have followed it in your research as you're writing your book. The Sheff versus O'Neill case has been going on for so long, and yet we're still adjudicating it in the courts. It's going to trial again in the fall. Why is that?
Why is it going back? Because I think the state has been trying to address the issue on the table, and I think the state would have to answer why it's taking so long, because the fact that chef plaintiffs felt the need to go back continuously, I think the question should be asked, put forward to the state. I couldn't speak for the state, but I will say this. I did my research on Chef versus O'Neill because I wanted to explore the issue of why we're dealing with school segregation in Connecticut, the cradle of the abolitionist movement. For me, it was puzzling. So using Chef as a window into the long civil rights movement of blacks in Connecticut, I got to understand the contours and complexities of the issues with dealing with blacks in education in the city. I must point out that Connecticut overall is doing well on the educational landscape. They score high on the NAEP tests and all the standardized tests. It's people of color that are not doing well, more particularly blacks and Latinos. So we need to actually examine that and look at why they are not doing well and others are.
Dr. Adams, I wanted to ask you about the Hartford Guardian because Dr. Close mentioned that there had been a newspaper established in Connecticut, the Hartford Chronicle, which was a black-owned paper, been out of business for a while now. But did you start the Guardian because you felt there was a need for a voice that wasn't being expressed?
Oh, most definitely. I felt there needed to be a space, a vehicle to talk about race in Connecticut. I felt it was not being discussed sufficiently. And I don't think we can address Chef versus O'Neill unless we talk about race. And unless we're willing to put that to the fore, I don't think we will resolve the issue with Chef versus O'Neill. And I will posit that that might be the case, why we don't have a resolution, because we don't want to talk about race. I do see that more people are talking about it, however, maybe in academia, and that's a good thing. I think what we need to do is bring it to the body politic so that people across Connecticut can feel comfortable talking about race. I think our society is not comfortable with that issue.
Dr. Foster, you mentioned having gone to Hartford High School, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you were doing during the civil rights era here in Hartford.
Hartford was a very heady place for a young man at that time. I lived in a housing project not far from here, and we had several options that was being proposed at the time. We had CORE, we had the NAACP, and as Dr. Close mentioned, we had the alternative of the Nation of Islam, or the self-help advocates being brought forth to the young black men. But I think I say without fear of contradiction that the civil rights movement in the 60s were the direct results of young, restless black men who simply had decided that they were not going to continue to accept the prevailing conditions. We had a young man who came along and made civil rights activism acceptable to us, and that was Wilbur Smith, because he seemed to be fearless. He was a working man. He was of the people, by the people, and for the people. But we also had met Cassius Clay. At that time, I recall meeting him at the Foot God Hall. And he talked to us about being the original man, which was a part of their cosmology. We heard Malcolm X speak, and that gave us food for thought. But I had the life-changing experience of meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. while standing on a street corner in North Main Street, Mail Avenue and North Main Street with some friends and the Reverend Battles and a high school acquaintance of Dr. King saw us standing on the corner and brought him over to us. And he encouraged us to stay in school. He talked about his work and how he needed us to help him to continue his work. And so that was a life-changing experience for me. I became active in the NAACP, and I'm still active today. But I decided that I wanted to go to school, but there was no avenue at that point in time. As Dr. Close has alluded, those of us who were fortunate enough to go to college or to obtain a higher education, we went south. And we had, as I said, the factories were available to us and other avenues of work. And so after being drafted, I came home and eventually ended up earning a degree and got involved with different avenues. But I became a cultural nationalist. I got involved with our history. I wanted to really understand who we were. So I started to do things like that. And I started the John Oliver Killens Theater Group. I met Chuck Stone, Charles Stone, who had served as the assistant to Adam Clayton Powell and worked with John Oliver Killens and folks like that. So that was my outlet. That was my way of contributing.
Dr. Close, Dr. Foster mentioned Martin Luther King, and one of the other essays that you authored for the book, African American Connecticut Explored, has to do with Dr. King having come here as a young man and having had the experience of really living for the first time in a non-segregated community.
He was part of a tradition of Morehouse men coming to Connecticut that actually went back to one of their former presidents, John Hope, who had been contacted by, I believe, someone from the Urban League about coming up to bringing workers up from the college up to Connecticut to work tobacco. And so he's part of that, a long stream, and he would spend two summers here. But each time he would come back, ministers who knew him would often hear him talk about having been in Connecticut. But his tie to Connecticut had to do with the friendships that he built, and also Dr. King never seemed to be really a stranger anywhere he went, I find. And he had this way about him being at home wherever he was. And so Connecticut, whether it be in Hartford or Bridgeport or Middletown, he seemed to have this way of knowing where he was and being at home, but also seeing what people were having to deal with and expressing it openly, because he was talking about poverty, he was talking about redistribution of wealth, and he was doing that in the North amongst people who many people at the end didn't like that message, but he was laying it out, pointing clear what the problems were.
You mentioned earlier Paul Robeson and the controversy over whether he could sing at the high school, at Weaver High School, and that had in part to do with the fact that he was alleged to have been tied to the Communist Party. There were other celebrities who came to Connecticut and lived in Connecticut and actually got involved, and one of them that I think of is Jackie Robinson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jackie he was born in a little village at the time of Cairo, Georgia, right near where I grew up in Georgia, and he is considered to be the greatest of heroes in terms of Southwest Georgia. But when he comes to Connecticut through his ties to Stanford, he and his wife initially were looking for a home and a place to have their children, and it was a newspaper article about lack of openness in some parts of Connecticut that would eventually lead him to Stanford, when they'll get a house on, I believe it's Cascade Road in Stanford. And he begins to establish himself as a champion off the diamond just as much as he was on the diamond. He became a voice for civil rights, and when churches were bombed in the South, he helped to raise funds to rebuild those churches. And his house became a stop in terms of not just civil rights activism, but also activism in the memory of, particularly in the end, in the memory of his son, who was a veteran of Vietnam, who had suffered the ravages of Vietnam. And that's something that Jackie remembered, and he also tried to work to confront and get people to see.
Anne-Marie Adams, you conducted an interesting project, an oral history project in Hartford about the civil rights era and other things. Tell us a little bit about how you conducted it, who spoke, and what you learned.
Okay. This was 2 summers ago at the University of Connecticut, Greater Hartford campus. And one of the things I wanted to do with this oral history project is to actually expand the narrative from it being about black men being restless and it being about black men, women, and children being restless. And also to give the idea that it wasn't just one black experience during the civil rights movement. There are a multitude of experiences. And I interviewed women who were also a part of the civil rights movement here in Connecticut. And we were talking about women like Trudy Mero, Ella Cromwell, who have died, Annette Scott, who was a black female journalist. She was the first one to actually run for mayor in the city of Hartford. Shirley Scott, thank you. And other women who played an integral role in the civil rights movement here. And I think as we move forward, those are the stories I captured in the oral history project. I interviewed also Dr. Foster, thank you very much, that wonderful interview, and a host of other players during the 60s and 70s and 80s, especially Thurman Milner, who gave us kind of the contours of the rise of the civil rights movement in Hartford, which happened, I think, maybe in the 1970s and the 80s. And the height of this was when he got elected.
Mm-hmm. And for people who don't know Thurman Milner, mayor of Hartford, and I think, wasn't he the first African-American mayor in New England?
Yes, he was.
Mm-hmm. And then later followed by Carrie Saxon Perry, another groundbreaking
right.
mayor here in Hartford.
Exactly, another foot soldier in the local civil rights movement here in Connecticut.
Yes, sir. Let's bring the microphone right over here, Ron, if you would. We can hear you, but we're recording this for TV, so.
I'm glad you raised Shirley Scott and other African-American women. For me, one of the most powerful women who hasn't really gotten her due, I think, is Isabel Blake, who was a leader in the welfare rights community. And there's very little about her. I think, first of all, I really appreciate the depth and experience of knowledge that all the panelists bring, because I think that's a wonderful event. But Isabel Blake would be a wonderful person to talk about, too, if anybody has had experiences.
Let me speak to that.
We have her on tape.
Mrs. Blake was a very, very wiry and very, very determined leader. She brought Adam Clayton Powell to Hartford. Is Charles Lewis here? Butch?
Lewis here?
Adam Clayton Powell, Isabel Blake we're speaking about. I recall when Isabel Blake and the Welfare Rights Organization had Adam Clayton Powell to come and speak down at Parker Memorial Center. And it was a very exciting time, and I recall the Black Panthers giving him their arm of protection. But Powell excited us and made us understand that we needed to desperately become involved in the political process. Isabel Blake also would move around the city and get help for women and children who needed the help. And she was just a living. I'm glad you mentioned her because she hasn't gotten her due, but she did so very much at the street level. And when we talk about street level bureaucrats, she was the epitome of that. And She knew the various laws and the codes, the U.S. codes and so forth, and she really got what she could to help people, and especially children.
Dr. Adams, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yes, he mentioned. I also want to mention Colin Bennett, who was on the city council when Thurman Milner was running. I see parallels here with the modern day civil rights movement. No one believed he could become mayor, and the question posed was, "Why are you running for mayor?" And his response was, "Why not?" which became his slogan. And he went to Colin Bennett, who organized a fundraising event at the West Indian Social Club, and that's how he got his first set of money to actually run for mayor. And I wanted to bring that to the front because when we have blacks moving from the South, we also had West Indians moving into the city, and we need to actually talk about that diversity within the black community and how they coalesced to form the civil rights movement here in the city.
I see Butch Lewis is here in the back over there. Mr. Lewis, if you don't mind me calling on you just for a moment. Dr. Foster mentioned about the Black Panther Party, and I believe that you were one of the people who started the Black Panther Party here in Hartford. And if you just tell us, what the motivation was and why you felt the Black Panthers needed to be here.
Well, I was one of the kids that came from NECAP, North End Community Action Project, and with Trinity students. So as that, like Dr. Foster, I got drafted when the Vietnam came back, and I'm saying, why am I going to die? I didn't die in Vietnam. Why the hell didn't I die here? So myself, Donnie Mounds, who also just came back from Vietnam, we started the Panther Party in January. And it thrives on from that, and we served breakfast for school program for kids, and the government didn't start the breakfast program. The Black Panther Party started that long before the government ever thought of it. So when people go along and say the government did this, that is a blatant lie. And we finally, the history is coming true of what happened. But Hartford was a crazy place. I grew up in the South. I came here and went to school with Brother Turner there. And I have a film of him, matter of fact, from the 60s with I'm going to bring some stuff back to him about the Bellevue Square Men's Club, who also did stuff in Bellevue Square that people never knew. This men's club stood for the rights of the people in the square. And I have a lot of films on the riots. You talk about Isabel Blake. I have a film on Mrs. Blake. It's like 52 or 38 films, short stuff. Some is long, some is short. But I just donated to the Hartford Library. So you can go into the historical department of the Hartford Library and look at any of this stuff freely and look at it and enjoy it, because you can see stuff that really happened. Hartford hasn't changed. That's the sad part. I was listening to him about education. Education system had the worst system of passing kids. No one never talked about the kids that's passed because they was in school. Those are the problem children we have today, and they are parents. So we got a major problem to deal with them. I think I see you throwing your hand up. If anybody got any questions, I ask.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Close, when I first came to Connecticut, I was working at Channel 8 in New Haven, and one of the first things that I heard about, and it was many years after this happened, but it was still reverberated so strongly in that area, and those were the Black Panther trials in New Haven after the murder of Alex Rackley. And I wonder how those trials in New Haven reverberated throughout Connecticut and throughout New England.
Well, probably the best person to answer that would be Mr. Lewis in the back, who was a member of the organization.
I think it affected me a lot. Affected my lifestyle. Not only that, a lot of people weren't concerned because most Northerners, or not as they were educated Northerners, they really, to me, didn't really care. A lot of people did. So supporters did. So, the Panther Party, by being infiltrated by the police department, FBI, that dissolved the party, A lot of us had to move out of the country. A lot of us had to go do other things, couldn't get jobs. So it was a thing that destroyed the party, Unfortunately, no proof was there. Only they processed Bobby. That was the main goal, to destroy the Panther Party by chopping his head off.
Would either of the other panelists like to comment on that?
Well, from my perspective, we were studying Frantz Fanon at the time, and we had many movements and different leaders, from Ron Karenga to others, who were providing us with different avenues. The Black Panthers were very important to the era, but they were not the be-all and end-all. So we all watched that trial very carefully, and we took note of the injustice. But there was so much happening at the time, and as I said, Dr. King had been assassinated, Malcolm had been assassinated, the Kennedy brothers had been assassinated, so we had almost become just numb to the kinds of things that were happening, but we were more fixed on the lack of jobs and the need for affordable housing here in the city, and the need for economic opportunity. Butch Lewis and others worked at the Project Matthews of the Urban League, as I recall, and helped to provide alternative education for young men and young women who needed to get a GED. And we had others who were advocating for black capitalism. We had the Albany Businessmen's League. We had Eddie Barlow Jr. and John Chappell, who started the first black bank here. We had Ray Jones, who became the first branch manager for CBT, which is now Bank of America. We had the unsung people, Ella Cromwell and others who were out there, and we call the playgrounds our university. We had Oris Smith, we had Paul Littman, we had all kinds of men and women who were working with the youth, who were encouraging us in spite of the obstacles that we were encountering to keep on keeping on. And then there was Curtis Mayfield, who all of us loved, and Curtis was saying, "Move on up." And we were listening, and the lyrics were very profound. And then there was the Coltrane influence and the Pharoah Saunders influence. And so we had so much happening at that particular point that helped to shape us and helped to keep our minds fluid. As opposed to today, our young people don't have a movement or movements to become a part of. And yes, there was the diaspora influence from the West Indies, and we started to listen to the music from the West Indies, and we helped to elect Colin Bennett to the city council, and we started to look at Pan-Africanism. And that was very important for us. And so the cultural nationalist piece became so important. So not to negate what happened in New Haven, but we were more fixed on what was happening here.
Dr. Adams, you had a strong reaction there.
Yes, because one of my questions to Dr. Foster was, what happened between the end of that movement and today, contemporary period? Did you guys forget to pass on the baton? What happened? Did someone drop the baton? why is there a disconnect, a generational divide, why that cultural influence didn't last or translate over to
Well, it's very simple. Southern blacks, to a large degree, started to leave the city in the late 70s. There was a reverse migration, and we're still having that reverse migration. And so many then moved out, and the literati, or the educated class, they are virtually nil now. And so we have a different group of people, a different set of agendas now, and I think that's, to a large degree, is happening in various parts of the northern inner cities. It's a different perspective, lack of movement, lack of leadership. But then we had some astounding success. We started to have people move from elevator boys to sitting on boards, becoming board of directors. We had busboys becoming chefs. So we did have a tremendous leap forward in many, many areas. And so many people who were out on the front lines became inside players.
We need to wrap this up, but I think that your question was so interesting that I think I'll pose the same question to Dr. Close as sort of a closing statement. What happened between then and now?
I think Dr. Foster's point about the reverse migration is very important, but also with that migration, particularly with our teachers, we left a lot of that history and culture out of the classroom now. Because those teachers, even though they weren't teaching the subject of black history, they were still putting it into the classroom. If you ever talked to any of them, they would tell you it was a part of their classroom. And I think that's a huge, huge void when you don't have students feeling as if they are part of the curriculum and they are part of what made America America. I think that plays a huge, huge role. Many of the people who are older residents of Black Hartford, they remember Dr. John Rogers and what it meant for him to go into these classrooms and talk to students, even though he wasn't officially their teacher. They still remember years ago John Rogers talking to them about the black presence in Africa and in America. And it stayed with them, and it also stayed with their children. And that's part of that gap.
Dr. Adams, what is on the agenda going forward? What should that agenda be, or what is it?
The agenda going forward is for the black community to stop equating leadership with maleness. Black women who were the backbone of the civil rights movement are moving to the fore. They will not be pushed aside anymore. Black women look to the left, and we have black men who oppress us and white women oppressed us. So we're thinking, okay, what happened to our struggle in the 1970s? We fought with black men, we fought with white women for rights, and we are being left out of the picture and stepped on. And black women are no longer afraid of being called angry. They're moving to the fore, they're voicing their complaints, they're voicing their frustrations, and they just want respect, like Aretha Franklin said. R-E-S-P-C-T.
And Dr. Foster, one last thought. You said there are many agendas out there now. What's the agenda going forward?
Well, cultural competency, as Dr. Close alluded to. We need to have African American history / black history taught in our schools, K through 12 curriculums, infused throughout, dealing with the sciences, literature, the humanities, because our kids are suffering from the lack of self-esteem. And so if this is made a part and parcel of the curriculum, I think we will see tremendous improvements. But jobs are what we need. And that's going forward in the 21st century. We can't do anything without jobs in an advanced technological society. Our people must obtain quality education in order to thrive not merely survive.
Well, I thank all three of you for being here with us today for a very interesting discussion. I appreciate it. And if you'd like to read the book that I discussed at the beginning here, African American Connecticut Explored, we do have it for sale in the Old State House shop, which is right across the hall. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Diane. And Dr. Foster's book is also for sale in the shop today. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you all of our guests, for this wonderful discussion. I think it will bring about many more discussions. You raised some really wonderful issues and points today. I'd also like to thank Connecticut Humanities for funding this program, and of course our partners at Connecticut Explored for holding this program with us. Thank you all very much.